Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Restricted Handling Podcast, where we try to break down all events, international security, and geopolitics. We are talking Russia, probably a little bit of Iran, but today with Sean Wiswesser. Sean has a new book coming out April 21st. It's called Tradecraft Tactics and Dirty Tricks, Russian Intelligence Operations. You can get it at Amazon and other places you find books. We're going to talk a lot about this today, also in the context of what's going on in Russia, Ukraine. Sean, I will allow him to introduce a little bit more of himself because he has served in some sensitive places. I want to make sure that we say it properly. The book has gone through the CIA review process, which is amazing. I got my hands on a galley copy in advance so I could prep for this. If you like this show, you're going to love this book. But I would and Sean, you correct me here, former CIA senior ops officer, former chief of station, almost 30 years in the national security space, lots of time overseas to include war zone time, but really with a heavy focus on Russian intel, counterintel, hybrid warfare tactics throughout several decades. It really pulls back the curtain on what goes on with Russian espionage and how it works historically, which is very cool, from the Chekists up to today. And there's a great chapter towards the end about how Russia prepared from an intel perspective to invade Ukraine, both 2014 and the more recent invasion with more depth to it that I think people will really like to read about if you like this program. Sean, we're so glad to have you, another Russia expert on the show. What other ways can we describe your background?
Well, no, thank you, Ryan. I think you did it very well. I really appreciate it. You and I were just talking about the fact I consider Glenn a great colleague I've known for decades. Honored to be on your podcast. I love the title, by the way, Restricted Handling. And I've been a listener for a long while now since you all stood up. So honored to be on your show. I think you captured it well. It is 3 decades now in national security. I retired in 2023. CIA allowed me to affiliate. There's some sort of restriction still on that. Well, we can say and not say, but I can say 28 years in the intelligence community, the vast majority of that time as a case officer of CIA. Honored to be a chief of station overseas, a chief of base, served in conflict zones. But I was a denied area specialist, as I talk about in the book. I focused a lot of my career on what I believe are some of our most professional and capable adversaries, the Russian intelligence services. They're also, in my opinion, the most corrupt in the world. So looking forward to spending the next short while discussing this and with you and your listeners, and I'm honored to be on board. One quick disclaimer: CIA always asks me to mention my views are mine alone and don't represent those of the agency nor the U.S. government at all. So thank you, Brian. Glad to be here.
Glad you said that. Okay, let's start with denied areas. We do have a lot of folks who listen to this who are very much in the know of what denied areas are, but we have some who don't. It's well known to folks in the IC, but at a high level, what are denied areas? And I think it'll come up very naturally here as we talk about Russia and what's going on in Iran are both great points here.
Yeah, sure. It gives me a chance to talk about CIA and espionage history, a little bit intelligence history. Some of the things I talk about in the book. So denied area operations traditionally refer to the areas that are hardest to operate for not only CIA but around the world, different services. Of course, it depends on what service you are. One of the things I share in my book, for instance, is that the Russian intelligence services consider some areas denied or difficult for them to operate. Some capitals in Europe are more so. Some are fairly benign for them to operate in. For the United States, of course, places like Moscow, Beijing, Iran, Tehran, we don't have a presence there, of course, but when we did, and when things are proverbially hitting the fan, those can all be denied areas or difficult places to operate. Focus of my book, of course, is on the Russian intelligence services, and they have some of the most capable counterintelligence services in the world. They're of course, infested with corruption at every level. They have a lot of nepotism and favoritism in their service, all things I talk about in the book. But they're still very capable adversaries that we need to continue to focus on the threat to the United States, to our government, and to our allies. My 10 chapters in the book, as you know, Ryan, are focused on different aspects of their tradecraft. Spent a lot on surveillance, street work, how they do surveillance, counter surveillance, how they do dead drops and signals. And so that all feeds into denied area operations. I will say that one of the important pieces of history that CIA let me include in the book, I'm honored was included. I came in a generation after the Cold War, although we never thought the Cold War was really over. Most of us hardcore Cold War veterans, like our former DDO, Mike Sulik, who I was honored, wrote the foreword to the book. Well, Mike passed on to us the lessons of his generation. There was a very famous CIA leader and former chief of station in Moscow named Burton Gerber. And Gerber was famous. I never met him, but his lessons from the 70s and 80s were transferred over to my generation, people like Glenn and I, from people like DDO Mike Sulik. And what Mike taught us straight from Burton Gerber's mouth was to say, listen, For CIA, there are no denied areas. We will operate everywhere that we're required to for the U.S. government and in order to go after our adversaries. So it was Gerber's way of saying, and I respect Mr. Gerber so much. He passed away sadly, like just last year, I believe. It was important for us to know we've got to operate everywhere in the world, so we have to use the highest levels of tradecraft to do it. So that's a little bit about denied area operations, a little bit about our history that I'm proud I was a small part of.
And actually, I should say Burton Gerber was a professor of mine when I went to grad school at Georgetown.
Awesome. You had him at
And
Georgetown. That's great.
he
Yeah,
was
awesome.
so good, and
Wow.
it was when I had just started work at the agency, and so he would
Awesome.
talk to me about just trying to help pass stuff on to the next generation, and I remember him saying something similar to what you just described, but he was like,
Yeah.
we have these analysts and people who have to understand what's going on in different places, but I always told my stations and my team members, nobody will know more about this location than us. We're going to know it inside and out because that's our job for the American people. So what a tremendous patriot that he
Yeah.
was.
Well, I'm glad we have a chance to talk about him. This is the first podcast I think his name has come up. Chapter 5 of my book, I mentioned him. I mentioned Mr. Sulik and other innovators of this tradecraft that was passed down to me and Glenn and our generation, and we continued it on. I was an instructor of the craft, as I was allowed to mention that in the book. And so it's important. It's an important part of our intelligence traditions. It's one we should be very proud of. I believe we're the very best at the world when it comes to our tradecraft. I don't talk about it in the book, but I can have some pride. I can at least say that it's a tradition that is passed on from those Cold War veterans.
If we look at what's going on with Russia and Ukraine right now, Sean, what do you think Russian intel would be doing if they were freed up more with Iran, if we were to be fighting this type of battle with Iran, but with Russia with its hands not tied behind its back?
I've been thinking about this very question, Ryan. The first thing that I shared in some recent commentary that was published, I mentioned I don't believe the Russian intelligence services, certainly, or any of the Siloviki in Russia, they're not mourning the loss of Khomeini. They're really not.
Mm,
They're not
interesting.
crying. Yeah, they're not literally. I said there's no tears lost for Khomeini. Why? Because there's no sentimentality to it. That's what I mean. They didn't consider this a close ally. For the United States, we have partnerships. We have allies. We believe in our allies. I'll never forget for me after 9/11, for the first time in the history ever of the United Kingdom, as far as I'm aware, when they play the Queen's, anthem every night, when they play their national anthem after 9/11, they played uh, our anthem. And it was very, very touching. I believe it's the first time they ever did that in history. That shows how close we are with our allies. They mourned with us. They felt the pain. They felt the existential attack and threat to the United States. Well, in the case of the Russian intelligence services, their military, they don't have that with Iran or Venezuela. What did they do when Maduro was taken out in this operation, which was very impressive by the military? Nothing, absolutely nothing. Even their statements to the media, again, like you said, they've got their hands full in Ukraine. But this was supposed to be a strategic ally for them. Nothing. Khomeini is targeted and killed in the war, and a lot of others in the regime. And what does Russia really have to say about it? Not very much. So it's not a strategic alliance, and they also don't have a strategic alliance with China. It's important to note they don't have Five Eyes style intelligence sharing. They don't, for the most part, do joint exercises. Last year was one of the first times in the history between Russia and China they did joint air defense exercises. So I don't believe Russia has allies like we have allies. I think they have fellow criminals in arms, regimes that may think authoritarian like they do, but they don't really coordinate and collaborate closely. So I believe what the Russian intelligence services, to your question, Ryan, most of all, they're looking at how they can benefit from the situation right now, both personally for their services.
Mhm.
How can they sort of benefit? But then if they can stick a finger in our nose or our eyes and damage the United States in this conflict, they're going to do it. So that overview sort of is what I think they're up to right now. But yeah, no love lost necessarily for that regime. It's just they used them. They just used Khomeini and Iran when it suited Russia.
I think that does come through clearly in the book too, just about the corruption, transactional nature of a lot of this
Yep,
work. And
that's it. Transactional nature of relationships. Yep, exactly. Yeah.
so you mentioned Venezuela, Sean, with Maduro being ousted. We've got decapitation strikes that have taken place in Iran, knocking out head of their intel service, head of their National Security Council, the supreme leader, the Basij. How do you think Russia is reacting to like the possibility of decapitation strikes within its own ranks? I mean, you've had some high-level generals taken out. Do you think this changes some of their posture or calculus?
Yeah, I don't think so. I wrote a piece last week. I said after the war, after Putin, succession scenarios. And the first thing I pointed out in the first paragraph is, remember, Russia is not Venezuela. It's not Iran. Unfortunately, Russia is a nuclear armed adversary with still a very capable military that's adapted very well to the Ukraine war. I wrote extensively from Air War College on the failures of Russian air power early in the war. Well, that was the first part of the Ukraine war story. Ryan, unfortunately and tragically for Ukraine, and for all of our allies in this fight with Ukraine, trying to assist Ukraine, we're not there actively fighting with the Ukrainians, although the Russians claim falsely we are. The Russian military has adapted tremendously well. So I don't think that there's ever any thought within Russia that they're concerned about decapitation strikes or they're seriously concerned about the regime falling because of the Ukraine war. More of a concern for Putin always is keeping his own population in check. The FSB, for instance, the Internal Security Service, their number one role is protection of Putin and the regime against their own people. Let's be honest. It's against their own people. That's what they're worried about the most. Putin was scared to death of the color revolutions. And he still is mortally afraid of democracy in Russia because, as I mentioned in the book, I know you, Ryan, I appreciate you having digested as well as you did. You know that I mentioned at the end of the book, if he had functioning democracies on all of his borders, he wouldn't be in power, and none of the Siloviki would be. Navalny was killed because he highlighted the corruption. He highlighted literally the golden palaces that all these Siloviki, these strong men, by the way, what a word for your cabinet. Imagine if the American people were told, the president said, my cabinet are my strong men. That's what I call them. The Siloviki, the strong men. Who are they so strong about keeping the Russian people, tight hold on the Russian people? That's their style of leadership. So it's that corruption again, Ryan. They're afraid of their own people, I think, more than the existential sort of military threat. The whole argument that the Ukraine war is about protecting Russia and a preventative war, it's complete nonsense, of course.
Because you've worked Russia for so long, as we look at how hard Putin has had to push on his own people, right? Getting troops to the front line, sustaining it. The economy is not in great shape by any means. They've increased some of the taxes. They've censored even more activity. What would it take for the Russian people to rise up, or even the intel services to turn face? Is that even possible in a scenario
Yeah,
like this?
sadly, I don't think so. Not currently. Sadly, the FSB has a tight hold on power. Remember, they have not only somewhere between, probably 70 to 100,000 of their own FSB officers all over the country, not just in Moscow, in regional, what they call upravlение FSB, regional FSBs. They have 200,000 border guards under the FSB. They have special elite operations units like Alpha and Vimpel and 3 other special ops teams under the FSB and other elite Ministry of Interior units. The one thing Putin's practiced very well in his 25 years in power, sadly, Ryan, is he knows how to put down any dissent. Now, Prigozhin, of course, the attempted mutiny uncovered a lot of weaknesses in the system, right? But the fact is, those of us that watch kind of Russian internal security dynamics know Prigozhin would not have gotten very far when he got to Moscow. Those elite units that protect Putin and protect the regime would have quelled the rebellion. He got far, but he got far because he went through Rostov military district. He had a lot of allies there. I studied on Rostov-on-Don. I know the geography very well. He went through units and military compatriots that had been fighting with him in Ukraine that weren't willing to kill other Russians. Had Prigozhin got to Moscow, I think the revolt would have been put down very quickly. Unfortunately, let's look at the situation, Ryan. Who's left in terms of opposition in Russia? The intelligentsia has been killed or they've left. Heroes like Anna Politkovskaya, a heroic journalist, murdered. Navalny murdered. Nemtsov, all these other leaders, they're gone. You have hundreds of thousands of the best, most intelligent, talented youth of Russia fled during the war. They fled, they left. So sadly, I think right now it's really hard to imagine any type of popular uprising within Russia. The other reason is that we need to remember the propaganda and how strong it is. Unfortunately, any opposition is a tiny trickle against a wave of popular support for a leader who's propped up with this ridiculous propagandized version, bizarro version of history that Russia was attacked by NATO and Ukraine, and Ukraine's heroic President Zelensky, oh no, by the way, he's a fascist, even though he's Jewish and he had members of his family die in World War II. And so it's bizarro world. I think the best chance for Russia, Ryan, to your point, the best chance for Russia is a slow understanding, a slow process of democratization that never really happened in the past 30 to 40 years. I don't think it's going to happen overnight.
In the book, you go from the Chekists up to modern day. And it feels like, if you look closely, not a lot has changed in the strong arm tactics, the way they approach work. If you had to really look at, the past few years, has much changed to you, Sean? Like, or is it really still rooted in this history?
Yeah, I point out in the book, there's a continuum here of over 100 years. Other excellent authors have pointed out. Sean Walker had an excellent book on the Russian illegals. I'd commend to your listeners. The Chekists, the Cheka, the first committee for the defense of the revolution, basically, the Chervechanye Komitet, the Extraordinary Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, and has a much longer title, was stood up, well over 100 years ago. And that was headed by Iron Felix Dzerzhinsky. And he prided himself on Lenin's famous phrase of "can't have a revolution without some terror." And so their motto was, "Let's terrorize the Russian and other Soviet peoples to keep to hold the population by the throat." And they practiced that then. Their regime, and then Stalin, who followed on from Lenin after the short time of some joint rule. Stalin, of course, consolidated power, and only Stalin and Catherine the Great have ruled Russia for as long as Putin. Let's keep that in mind. All the leaders in Russian history, there's only two that have now led longer. And Putin, over his years in power, he's consolidated power very much like Stalin did. The security service has been strengthened. Now, I'm not going to compare the atrocities done by Stalin or on par with the most horrible atrocities in all of history. Stalin killed millions and millions of his own people. Putin's not at that level. But in terms of the security services, they've never been as stronger than and since that period. They roll with an iron fist. They stamp out any opposition. It's against the law to even say there's a war going on in Russia right now. You're not even allowed to say it's a war. So yeah, I think that continuum, that pride in the Chekists, Putin himself buys into this and feeds this mythology that during the time of the Soviet Union, the KGB, as he often says, he was a member of the KGB, of course. He later headed the FSB. Oh, they were the elite of Soviet society. Really? I thought that nothing worked in the Soviet Union. I got there shortly after the Soviet Union was collapsing. My wife grew up in the Soviet Union. Her father worked in the Ministry of Interior of the Soviet Union. They'll tell you, anybody that lived in that country, everything was broken. Nothing worked. Nothing worked. And the KGB was responsible for all of that. So it's a mythologized history of Chekism and how elite they are and were. But it's hard to break into it against, again, the heavy propaganda right now.
Maybe from what we know of those decades, 100 years of very similar activity from Russian intel services, should that help us better predict how they're going to respond to different world events? Like, was it surprising to you that they were not as effective as they could have been when they invaded Ukraine? I say invaded the second time, like 2022, 2023.
Yeah, good point.
Any surprises?
Yeah. Yeah, so one of my frustrations, my colleagues at War College that I studied with know that I was hammering on this question whenever we had speakers come. We had some really great, awesome speakers from across the community. I would frequently ask the question, "How did we get it so wrong?" And a lot of students that were there with me at War College would say to me after, "Sean, what did you mean? Why we got it wrong?" Well, we did get it wrong. Yes, we knew Russia was going to invade, and we warned the world. But then we were wrong about the fact so many US and other allied intelligence services, all these talking heads that were on the news, Ryan, they underestimated the will and strength of the Ukrainian people to fight back. And so many, it's so easy to buy into our version of understanding sort of the great Soviet army, the Red Army, the now Russian Federation. Remember all those generals on TV constantly saying, "Now we're going to see them encircle Kiev very quickly. Within a couple days, within a couple weeks, this war is over." I think understanding history can also work against you in some ways. And I think, though, in the case of the intelligence services, a lot of their tactics, the tradecraft I focus in the book, they do repeat that tradecraft. They do use that over and over. It's not necessarily indicative or that we can use it to predict sort of political actions, because so much of that is dependent on Putin and his personality alone. I'm a believer. Many writers like Harding and Owen Matthews wrote great books, Overreach and the invasion in Ukraine. And they focused on the fact that, it was a very small circle probably that knew about the invasion and were planning it with Putin. Many soldiers, as we found out later, got to the front lines and were crossing the Ukrainian border and still thought it was an exercise. So I think in that type of regime where so much power is concentrated in such a small circle, Ryan, it's hard to know really what's going on. But I do think we need to do a better job of kind of red teaming and thinking and saying, wait a second, are they as powerful as we thought? And then the flip side of that, Ryan, there's been a lot of really good writing recently by Rand and other groups saying, hey, just like we got it wrong in 2022 thinking the Russians would win, let's not underestimate their adaptability now. And this is something I've been writing on as well, some of my articles. They have adapted remarkably well. They've stood up an entire drone contingent to their armed forces, the unmanned systems troops, units like Rubicon. These are difficult questions, and I think we need more focus and more attention on it right now.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'd ask for your experience take on this intel problem, which you really nicely laid out. You could see it in Afghanistan, you could see it in Iran now, we saw it in Ukraine, which is this idea, even from us looking at Afghanistan, we didn't think it was going to fall the way it did when we pulled out. We thought there would be more resistance or somebody there to help sustain. Clearly got it wrong with Ukraine, or the Russians kind of misinterpreted, and then vice versa, the way you said it. I think in Iran, and it's still early days, a couple weeks in, more resistance than maybe some people anticipated. But from an intelligence perspective, how do you get enough sources in place to understand the will of people? Like, I don't know if that's an intelligence question you can solve. It seems like
sure.
such a
Yep.
hard one.
Yeah, I think it shows, the importance of human intelligence,
Yeah.
Ryan, the field that you and I and Glenn, we all worked in together, and appreciate all of your service and everyone else who served. You can't get around needing a spy somewhere in the network that knows what's going on. If you don't have somebody in that inner circle or access to that inner circle, how could you possibly understand the various machinations of people like Putin who are ruling with an iron hand and a very small group of his Siloviki, or Maduro for that matter, or Khomeini. So human is irreplaceable, and for generations, we've heard decades, everyone in the intelligence community and broader community constantly saying, "Oh, it's about SIGINT, it's about imagery intelligence. It's about all the sensors and the technical data and ELINT." Yes, 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 and yes. All those things are very important. But you can't replace having a spy somewhere that has the knowledge, Ryan, to say, hey, I know what's going to happen. One of the things I was very proud of in the book, the epilogue, as you know, Ryan, I pay tribute to Russian spies that have helped us. I have a lot of disdain for their services. I have tremendous respect for Russians that it was my privilege to work with, and other colleagues of mine like Glenn and many, many others have worked with true hero spies, those that are willing to risk everything to help the United States and help the West, many of which are living here in the United States and defected. I have the privilege of also working with, debriefing them as defectors, as I mentioned in the book. We need spies like that. We need hero spies willing to take the chance and the ultimate risk for the United States, and we're in their debt when they do.
I just finished reading The Spy in the Archive, the biography
Yeah,
about Mitrokin,
yeah. Matrokin, yeah, awesome. Yeah,
which was just fascinating.
yeah.
Just his own perspective, having been inside those big organizations and how well they were treated for so long, like really like the top first class of society, as you described. You've got a great set of chapters on the illegals, right? Which is a little closer to this time frame compared to like some of the Cold War stuff. And first of all, could you just give an overlay? What are the illegals for people who might not know it as well? And then where did they fall within the rank of the Russian intel services?
Yeah, great. Well, I love digging into this stuff now. Now we're digging into some of the tradecraft details. First of all, kudos to Gordon Carrera. He's had a number of really good books. Cite Russians Among Us, his study of the illegals. Then you mentioned Vasily Mitrokin, the famous, archivist, defector who helped us with so much information. Well, I quote him quite a bit in my study on the illegals. Mitrokin himself, he reeled so much to us. So what is a Russian nelegal or illegal? So in our terminology, this is a non-official covered officer operating abroad. But in particular, the term nelegal means operating on a passport, another nationality, a different passport. Now, most of those illegals throughout the Cold War and since, cases like ghost stories from the FBI case, the joint case that CIA worked with FBI, and CIA allowed me to discuss some in my book and my chapter on illegals. Most of them acquire their false nationality by transiting another country and then getting what they'll call a dead doubles. They'll find a birth certificate from a child that died in their youth, or in the case of the one illegal I talk about, Rudy Herman, it was the identity of a German soldier that died in Stalingrad. They pick up that identity, and then they get other paper for it, other certificates, and then they build it towards getting a passport. And of course, passport is the golden ticket. When you have a passport, as we all know in the United States, you have a passport, you can get anything. You can get driver's license, you can get anything. So it's harder in today's digitized world. A huge network of illegals was wrapped up operating through Brazil recently. I was only able to mention it briefly in my book as kind of a footnote because my book had already kind of gone to press when I wrote. So these illegals, they're out there operating under different passports and nationalities. Why do the Russians do it, Ryan? It's always been a part of their culture. I mentioned earlier Sean Walker's excellent book about illegals, 100 years of Russian illegals. It's always been a part of their culture, even back to the revolution. The Bolsheviks were operating themselves as illegals. Lenin and other revolutionaries always had false passports. They were transiting borders. Lenin famously rode in the sealed train back to the Finland station. The Germans were okay with him transiting as a revolutionary to go into Russia and hopefully kick Russia out of the war. So this is a part of their history and that Chekist history and tradition. When Putin welcomed those, and he keeps doing it, when he welcomed the illegals in 2010, and then there was another big spy swap in 2024, I opened my illegals chapter talking about those illegals from Slovenia that he greeted with the flowers off the plane, and those poor kids. Those poor kids are like, where in the world are we? Poor little children. They didn't do anything wrong, but they're like, this is Russia, Moscow.
And
They
just
didn't
for
even know.
people listening, these are
Yeah,
illegals who have been kind of removed from where they were operating, coming back to the motherland.
yeah, yeah. If you look at the spy swap that happened in 2024, it included these Slovenian illegals who were posing, I think it's Argentinian citizens, and living in Slovenia. And so illegals are out there. They do a lot of different type of work. They try to penetrate governments, mostly unsuccessfully because it's really hard. I mentioned the case of Rudy Herman. This was an ethnic Czech who was pretending to be a German who emigrated falsely via Canada to the United States. Well, as he pointed out, and I copy and I quote him in my chapter on illegals, he was working at different times as a cameraman, and then he ran a deli. Well, the Russian center, the KGB center, kept telling him, hey, we want you to penetrate the Hudson Institute in New York. And he's like, hey, I make sandwiches with mustard or without mustard. How the hell am I supposed to penetrate the Hudson Institute? I mean, it was a great quote. I love that quote. He told me personally. I mentioned the book. My wife and I studied Czech language with him. It was our great shock to learn that he was a former illegal. And CIA, well, it's an interesting story. I'll leave it to the readers. But what the CIA said when I tried to report that, I think I'm being trained by a defector in language. And they're like, no, it can't be him. Like, no, it definitely was. It definitely was him. I got to know him and his family pretty well. Anyway, Rudy Herman was an example that it's really hard to do that job and to infiltrate governments. Mitrokhin himself, you mentioned Mitrokhin. I quoted him in a book that his study he did in the 60s and 70s. For the most part, Russian illegals were mostly unsuccessful penetrating governments. There were notable exceptions, though, where they did tremendous damage, and there continue to be. I mentioned the case of the Anschlag couple, that when the ghost stories were wrapped up, the Russians that were in the United States, there was a couple operating, I believe it was in Germany, and they did damage. They recruited a NATO spy. So these illegals, it's important we focus on them, Ryan, because they continue to be part of the Russian history and lore and culture of their intelligence services, and Putin loves them. As I said, he greets them on the plane. He sings songs with them. It's all part of it in Russian TV. Yeah, illegals is a big tactic of theirs, big part of the Tradecraft.
Fascinating. Yeah, again, for people who enjoy that kind of trade craft, like the book is great in illuminating this. I don't know exactly who made this quote. I think it may have been Napoleon, but this idea of when your enemy's making a mistake, just let them continue. It's something like that. So we're watching Russia fight Ukraine. Obviously, loss of life is tragic. I say this very, very much from like having been in the war zones, just as you have, and people who have served. From an American foreign policy and power perspective, are you to some degree hoping to see this war come to an end quickly? Would you like to see Russia bogged down until maybe people revolt? What would you like to see happen with this war now, Sean?
I do a case study of the Russian intelligence services, their culpability, their false prognostications, their idiocy, really, and leading Russia to disaster in Ukraine. And they had a huge role in it. The FSB, Fifth Service, it used to be the Fifth Department under the KGB. They're in charge of operational analysis for the president, Ryan. And I reported very convincingly, I believe, from open sources and even Russian bloggers that I quote. It's a well-known fact, even within Russia, that the FSB Fifth Service had a huge role in leading their country and Putin into war. Now, it was his decision. He has to own it. He believed he had his historical imperative to destroy Ukraine because it never really existed, even though, as we all know, Ukraine and Kiev and Rus existed well before Muscovy Rus, right? So Kiev and the Ukrainian identity, of course, predated the Russian identity, but none of that history matters to Putin. Listen, here's how I feel about it. This is also a historical imperative for us, the United States and our allies, Ryan. Nowhere in the world is the struggle for freedom and defending the rights of an individual people and an individual person to decide what they're going to do in the world and what they're going to do in terms of Ukrainian people's future. Nowhere is it more stark than in Ukraine right now. So we as a country that stands for freedom, we as the arsenal of democracy, we can't afford to sit this one out. The 20th century was called the American century precisely because we stood by our allies. We stood by Europe fighting against the tyranny of the Soviet Union, the various evil empires, as Ronald Reagan correctly called the Soviet Union. So we can't afford to just sit on the sidelines. I believe we're doing as much as we can. I believe we're smartly assisting with aid, but we have to continue to do so. You know, I think it's a tragic war, Ryan. I really hope it ends, but I hope it ends on Ukraine's terms. They were the ones that were assaulted. They were the ones that were invaded twice, 2014 and 2022. The final thing I'll say, if you allow me to, I wrote an article too a few months back, and I don't know that I got as much attention as I hoped. You write an article, you hope people read it. Some people did. I quoted Churchill from when the United Kingdom was standing alone against Nazi tyranny. Churchill famously gave this talk. He gave an address to France when it was occupied. Americans can be compared sort of to the war-weary people of Europe after the First World War. We had 20 years of war. Americans are tired of it. They don't want to hear about it. Churchill said something very, very salient at that time, and I can't do him justice, the great order of democracy, defender of democracy that he was, but he said, you know, the dawn will come. Brightly will it shine on all who suffered for the cause, gloriously upon the tombs of heroes. Thus will come the dawn. The dawn is going to come. This war is going to end. The light's going to shine gloriously on those Ukrainian heroes who died for the cause. We also have to suffer for the cause. We also want to stand in history and say that we, the United States, the arsenal of democracy, we did our part. So I know that we're a war-weary population. You and I both served in war zones. I appreciate your service, Ryan, with countless tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of our military colleagues and intelligence community veterans. But this is a fight we need to be in, and we need to see it through. That's how I feel. I feel very strongly about it.
Oh, I love it. And then you look at maybe a post-war world where, let's say that some peace negotiation works, and maybe there are boundary lines drawn in the sand of what Russia controls that is Ukrainian territory today and is considered Russia in the future. Knowing what you know about the Russian intel services, what do you think they do in that post-war theater, including like terrain that used to be Ukraine's?
Yeah, very good question. So we know what the Russian intelligence services are going to do. This is telling. They'll immediately move on to the next fight. The next country that they want to undermine, and the Baltics are very high on that list. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. My own wife is Lithuanian, part Lithuanian. She's also, by the way, part Russian and Ukrainian, like a lot of families in that part of the world. The Baltics are in Putin's crosshairs because he, again, can't stand. He's got functioning democracies on his western borders. Can't have that example of democracy. Can't have people exercising freedom and, by the way, living at a much elevated standard of living compared to the Russians and others who were left behind when the Soviet Union collapsed. The Baltics pushed forward. They're hardworking people. They've accomplished a lot. So they're right in his crosshairs as well, just like Poland, just like many of the other countries in Eastern and Central Europe. They'll continue to try to undermine any democracy in Ukraine, whoever's in the leadership there, Zelensky or anyone. But they're going to go after other targets. Ukraine was just part one, I believe, in a much larger plan Putin still hopes to realize in reclaiming the Soviet Union. What did he call it? The greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. Really? Really? World War II wasn't the most calamitous event in all of history? 50 million people dead? The tragedy of Stalin's purges in the Soviet Union, 20 million of their own people dead. But what does Putin mourn? Putin mourns, oh, gee, the geopolitical collapse of the USSR. Why? Because that's what benefited him and his buddies, his Rubiata, his guys, his Siloviki. I thought it was an asinine comment he made I think he's a very intelligent leader, but to say that the collapse of the Soviet Union, greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. So he didn't learn the lessons of history. And unfortunately, he's led Europe again into disaster. It's our part, Ryan, to provide a credible deterrent. And thus far, we have not, unfortunately. We need to provide a credible.
You touch on in the book several times some of the other tradecraft, including extrajudicial killings and how those are set up and orchestrated. You mentioned Navalny earlier. Sean, would just love to get your take for somebody who studied Russia. Like the idea that Navalny went back into Russia, obviously that he died, lots of questions raised about how he died.
Yeah.
How much of a loss was that to the Russian people?
It's hard to, I think, Ryan, it's hard for a lot of Americans, myself included at times, to understand a Russian hero like that. You have to read. I was a Russian literature major, and I still don't understand that type of heroism. I liken it to, Pasternak's novel, Dr. Zhivago. If you remember, at the end, the poet Zhivago has a chance to leave Russia, and one of the other characters in the story says, don't you know him well enough to know he'll always die in Russia? He'll never leave that country. So someone like Navalny, Tragically, I think some of his family and those that loved him and mourned him said, he knew he probably would die in Russia, but that was the fight he was fighting. He was fighting for the Russian people and for their freedom, and he was going to stand up to the regime. That type of heroism, it's hard to understand. We have to admire it, but we also have to stay convicted in our purpose to fight against the Russian intelligence services who murdered him, who tried to murder Sergei Skripal while he's living peacefully in the UK, who murdered Litvinenko, who murdered Politkovskaya and so many other heroes that were trying to fight for freedom. So we honor them by continuing the fight and keeping our eyes laser focused on the Russians and what they're trying to do in the West, including that malign influencing, the active measures, meddling in our elections and the elections in the UK, Brexit. They've done it. They continue to do it, not against any one candidate, but against our entire system, undermining our entire system of free and fair elections. So we need to stay laser focused. It requires a whole of society approach, I believe, Ryan. That's the best thing we can do to honor heroes like Navalny.
You mentioned a couple times, like obviously writing a book, not easy. It goes to, it has to go to print at some point where you got to stop writing and then you got to wait
Yeah,
for
yeah,
it
yeah, yeah.
to come out and then get released. And there's all these timing factors and it takes time. Since you put the pen down on that, what are a couple of the things you wish you could have included in the book that have happened since that you think would have made, a few of the pages or a chapter here or there?
Yeah, good point. Yeah, yeah. I finished the book about a year ago. You're very smart on the process, so Ryan. So since then, many of the things have proven true in terms of the sabotage campaign. I would have doubled that chapter. By the way, chapter 8 on sabotage. A lot more material now in the past year. The Russians continue in Europe, blowing up rail lines, drone incursions, all sorts of hybrid and gray zone actions. They just continue. But I stand by everything I wrote is played out. The cable cuts in the Baltic Sea that I talked about briefly in chapter 8, they now have had more cable cuts in the Baltic Sea as a result of Russian shadow fleet tankers accidentally cutting lines. Geez, we accidentally dragged our anchor 100 kilometers. There's been more in that part of the world than anywhere else in the world, And my next kind of project I've been writing and thinking a lot about is, what about Russia's next war? How would they carry out the next war? I hope that our intelligence community and is spending a lot of time on those same questions.
I do think when you think about the next war, they just seem to have depleted so much of their arsenal, from mechanized capabilities, missile stockpiles. Certainly, they've still got drones. There's still a lot of missiles. It just seems like they need time to rebuild. But I don't know how Putin's, obviously nobody knows, but like his timeline and what he wants to execute on, does it match what his forces could do?
I believe, like many experts, Ryan, the Russians continue to adapt very well, as the Ukrainians have too. The Russians probably, in terms of the drone war and drone adaptability, they're far ahead of NATO. We have a long way to go. And by the way, Ukraine could be teaching us a lot. Why are we not flooding Ukraine with tens and hundreds of thousands, even, of experts from the military and commercial? Russia thinks we're doing that. They think, but we're not. Really, by and large, we're not. We have a lot more to learn from Ukrainians. We see that in the Iran war now. The Ukrainians are saying, hey, by the way, we offered before. We have so much we could be learning from them. So I think that these are important questions we need to spend a lot more effort on in the United States and with our allies, understanding how Russia's adapted so well. One of the things that you have to live in Russia, and even living there and experiencing it as I have, and many of my colleagues like Glenn have, you look at the Russians as a people, their ability to endure suffering. Ryan, it's hard to underestimate. My own wife, she had members of her family. Her great grandfather was executed by the SS, along with his son. Both of her grandfathers fought in World War II for the entirety of the war at the front. Her grandmother and grandfather met at the front. Her Russian and Ukrainian grandmother and grandfather on that side of the family. So in Russia, these stories endure. Everybody sort of has a story like that. And that's why, by the way, the narrative of replaying World War II in Russia has so much resonance, Ryan, is because it's still remembered now. The Russians have a saying, "Никто не забыт, ничто не забыто." No one is forgotten, nothing's forgotten. So Putin's played on that. He's played on it very well, the memories of World War II. And their ability to endure suffering, it's hard for most Americans to understand. Not that we haven't suffered in wars, but remember, in World War II, the Soviet peoples lost 20 million of their people. We lost 400,000 soldiers. They lost 20 million of their people. So it is hard for us to understand. And they're doing it today, 1.3 million casualties. And yet they're still adapting and still fighting.
Sean, this has been great, man. I wish you the best of luck. The book's coming
Thank
out.
you.
Get your hard copy April 21st. Depending on when people listen to this, we'll have a link in the description so you could find it. It's It's all the stuff we love talking about. Sean, how do people find you? Where would you point folks to who
Yeah,
want to
thank
hear
you. So
more?
I have an extensive profile on LinkedIn. I think is the best place that I post a lot of my stuff. I'm also on X at Wiswesser. But yeah, the book's available 21 April around the world with a great press, Naval Institute Press, which is a nonprofit, benefits the U.S. Navy. Hope you'll consider buying the book and reading it. You can get it in the U.S., UK, around the world. 21 April. Tradecraft Tactics and Dirty Tricks: Russian Intelligence and Putin's Secret War. I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud of the team effort that's gone into it. Ryan, thanks so much for having me. It's been an honor. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening and being a part of the RH community. Would you like to receive the same daily intel brief that Glenn and I read? You can get it for free at restrictedhandling.com. We've curated what we consider to be the most relevant and reputable sources on all things international security, geopolitics, military and intel ops, and economics and sanctions, focused exclusively on Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and the Middle East, to include accompanying podcasts for Russia, China, economics, and spy stories. Just head to restrictedhandling.com, enter your email, and you'll get the daily briefs that Glenn and I both read, and you can leave comments and questions that we can respond to. Thanks again for listening. Stay safe.